Hello there, John Kuturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining us for this episode. As usual, thank you to everybody who makes this work possible. And also, as usual, if you have concerns about yourself or somebody else, please never take what you find on the internet or in the media as advice. Always seek advice from a professional or somebody else that you trust. If you are in Australia and are seeking counselling from me, you can find my details in the description of this episode. And in today's episode, it is my pleasure to welcome Lindsay Malkinson coming to us from North America. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Lindsay, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Well, I'm a book author. I have an Amari business focused on mental wellness. I also am an autism advocate and an inspirational speaker.
Wonderful. And for anyone looking to support you or to find your work, links to your work will be in the description of this episode. Today, we're going to be discussing autism. We're going to be providing some introductory explanation of what autism actually is. We're going to be looking at what the official definition of autism is, but then also looking at how an individual's lived experience and drawing on Lindsay's lived experience as well, most importantly, matches this definition and where it can diverge. And we're also going to be debunking myths because, as with any issue that is important, there is misinformation, and it's important that we approach the issue compassionately but also firmly and debunk the myths so that we can actually make rational, helpful decisions on it and not based on misinformation. To start with, let's give ourselves a baseline. What exactly is autism? Well, the word "aut" or the morpheme "aut" comes from the root which means self. And the official definition of autism is that it's a neurodevelopmental condition, and neurodevelopmental means that it affects the structure of the brain and the nervous system, and in that it's different to what is considered to be biologically most common. And it's characterized by a number of different sets of traits. And the most prominent ones that are explored in medicine are difficulties with interpersonal functioning, that is to say, difficulties with interacting with other people. That in itself can have a number of subdomains. It can involve difficulties with interpreting subtleties in people's communication, for example, taking cues or taking words or expressions literally. Difficulties detecting the subtleties in body language or facial expressions. It can be difficulties in understanding what norms apply in different social or communication situations. In some cases, in more severe cases, it can involve a delay in the development of speech when a person is young. It can involve a relatively narrow focus or a limitation in the interests or types of actions that people take, and it can involve people having a desire to repeat and very intensely engage in those interests. It can involve being rather fixated on order or predictability, which is a rather nuanced subject that we may get to later. It can involve sensory sensitivities, which means having difficulty engaging with sensory experiences that are intense that way, or alternatively, it can involve understanding the world through sensory experiences themselves, so having an intense need for certain sensations. And it can also involve other delayed developmental milestones. So in the course of human development, there are certain expectations that when a person develops at a given age, they'll be able to accomplish certain things or enact certain skills. If a person is autistic, then there may be delays in their ability to meet those milestones. Now, that's a medical definition, but as people have heard me say before, academic psychology often has trouble conceptualizing and describing and explaining things that can't be cut and dried that way. So often there is a lot of nuance that isn't captured by definitions. So, Lindsay, let's start here. Would you like to tell us your own story as an autistic individual and how well you think that definition actually matches the lived reality of being autistic, and also where you think some of the truth is, but also where some of the myths are in that definition? And start where you'd like to and tell us your story and what we can learn from that.
I was diagnosed when I was 11 years old at the BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver, BC. And one thing that I've always really struggled with is texting people so many times where it's hard for me to wait for a response, and quite often I can overwhelm people, and not because I want to, it's just because for me with my autism, sometimes I have a hard time waiting, and sometimes it's hard for me to understand, or like if I don't hear back after a certain while, I'm like, oh no, are they mad at me or did I do something wrong? Another thing is I have a really hard time understanding jokes. People could be joking and I don't know if it's a joke or actually literal thinking of what they're saying. And so that's another really big one. And then another one for me, it's just understanding when people mean what they say or if they don't mean what they say.
You've made a number of interesting points, and I'd like to use them as a learning opportunity for our audience. Something that people don't often understand is that just because you are aware of something, it doesn't mean that you can immediately change it. And the analogy that I often give to people when they doubt the reality of mental illness or of neurodevelopmental conditions or of neurodivergence, I give them this analogy. I say, if a person doesn't believe that brains can have different structures that affect how we think and feel and behave, and that ultimately there can be limitations in how we think, feel, and behave based on those structures, we could effectively concede that we could cut off somebody's head and expect them to keep breathing and thinking. If it's impossible to cut off someone's head and for them to still keep breathing and thinking, then it's irrational to then assume that a person can't have a mental illness or a neurodevelopmental condition, because even though we don't know specifically necessarily what parts of the brain may cause specific conditions or specific neurodivergences, it makes no sense to concede that the brain is absolutely an essential part of life, but not admit that it's also an essential part of how we think and feel. All too often, people are quick to assume that if somebody knows that there's something about themselves that's different, that it's easy to change it. And that's really stigmatizing. I want to ask you, in the moments where you feel like it's hard for you to wait for a response, text messaging, can you try to describe in words what that experience is like? What would hypothetically happen if you were in a situation where you're aware of the fact that you didn't want to push yourself onto someone, but you still felt the need to text them again, like repeatedly? What would happen if you tried to resist that urge? Can you describe what the inner experience is?
Yes, so for me, it's kind of like my brain it's hard to stop the way my brain thinks because it's overwhelming. And it's almost like this urge just to like have so much information in my head where I don't know how to process it all, and then it's just like word dumping where I someone would text me and it would be hard for me to wait for a response. So like I text them all this stuff and I'm like, "Oh, I should wait." But then it's really hard for me to wait because just the way my brain works, I can't literally wait for a response. Like I know I can, but actually saying and doing something and actually doing what you say is actually really hard.
I understand. So if you were to try to resist that urge, there'd be quite a sense of anxiety or stress associated with it, to the point that sometimes just giving into the urge is the only way to really make yourself be able to concentrate on anything else. Because until you get to that point, it feels impossible to actually turn your focus to anything other than that immediate concern of making sure that this person hears everything.
Yes, for sure. And it's also just like waiting for that because you can say and do and you can say, "Oh, I should wait." But then when it actually comes down to waiting, it's a whole other ball game. And for people to actually respond, I think that when I reach out too many times, it overwhelms them and then they don't even know how to respond.
What you're describing there is in the domain of what we call executive functioning. And this is something that is not taught enough in psychology. New therapists often don't know this enough, and we don't often educate our clients enough about it. So it's really important that this becomes more common knowledge. But executive functioning is the most basic ability of your brain to process information and carry on daily tasks. And everything you do, from the most simple tasks to the most complex tasks, involves that functioning. It's the ability to actually make choices and do things deliberately. Most of the time, we're not aware of it because we do much without thinking, consciously at least. But what's often not understood is that in neurodivergence or in cases of mental illness, often that executive functioning is affected in ways that we're not aware of. And when people experience overwhelm or what we call brain fog, sometimes people describe it as brain fog if they're having episodes of depression or anxiety or psychosis. What we're actually describing is a problem in executive functioning. Now, again, I go back to my analogy that if someone was to argue that just because you are aware of the problem, that you should be able to fix it instantly, then we could also make the argument that I should be able to put my hand on a hot stove and focus on reading a book at the same time. If anyone's ever burned themselves, most of us have, you will know that that pain is so intense that for a split second you're unable to focus on anything but the pain, and that is your body's way of making sure that your focus turns where it needs to go. If you are neurodivergent or have a mental illness, often your ability to turn your focus towards something, if something else is taking your attention, is so difficult that the only way to relieve that discomfort is to give into an urge. That's not to minimize that it can be a problem for some people, but it's to say that it's not deliberate. It's not something that you can just choose to eliminate. It's something that is really a part of how we work. And thankfully, we're developing safe therapeutic approaches to help people live a fuller life and live happier, more comfortable lives without being affected as much by it. But we also have to understand that our natures are different. Don't put blame on them and say, well, if you're aware of it, then you must be able to change it, because it can be difficult for some people. And that sort of sentiment really stigmatizes it and makes people feel worse than they may already feel. Embarrassed about it. As you've described, Lindsay, it can already feel like you're imposing yourself on someone. So
No, I definitely agree with that. And also, kind of another thing to explain is sometimes I get focused on one thing, and sometimes it's really hard for me to change the topic because when I get fixated on something, it's like the only thing I can really think about in the moment. When you get focused on something and then try and break the pattern and focus on something else is a whole other thing.
Lindsay, I'm curious about your opinions on the medical or the official accepted definition of autism. Do you think it encompasses well what an autistic person might experience, what the autistic community in general experiences, or do you think there are some discrepancies in it or some areas where it could be improved?
I think there's some areas that it could definitely be improved. When I was diagnosed with autism when I was 11 years old, I was actually misdiagnosed a few times because autism wasn't as common as it is today. Um, a lot of times people are trying to understand it, but we almost need the lived in experience to understand it. And a lot of times, for instance, April is Autism Acceptance Month, and April 2nd next month is Autism Acceptance Day. But honestly, I feel like autism should be accepted every day, and we need to understand that this is our reality. And just because it's 1 month out of the year, it's great, but it needs to be accepted and understood, and people need to try and step into our shoes more often and try and understand what we're going through. And I'm not trying to say that people aren't, but in a way, a lot of times I feel like people don't take the time to actually get to know us. And just because you know one person on the spectrum is great, you know one person, but everyone has a different experience on the autism spectrum, and it's really important to listen and learn to everyone because everyone has a story to share. And I think it's really important just to maybe think, see, and do, and maybe explain it a different way. If we do have autism, people can ask us questions instead of just assuming that, oh, this is what we go through. Maybe we could be asked a question, because a lot of times, for instance, people sometimes think that I am silly, so they'll talk, like if they're talking to me, they'll talk to someone else in the situation. There'll be two people in the room. But instead of making eye contact with me, they talk to someone else, and they don't take the time to actually listen and learn and get to know me.
And that could be hurtful and incredibly stigmatizing. Let's look at some of these specific parts that need challenging of our commonly accepted assumptions. There's a myth that we know for certain that there are specific environmental or epigenetic, that is to say, how we interact with our environment, causes of autism. And often there have been myths espoused in the past that specific vaccinations cause autism, which I believe at least some of, if not all of the studies that suppose that were actually found to have been erroneous. So there's that reassurance. But otherwise, there is no specific evidence that demonstrates that vaccines cause autism. Any correlation seems to be completely coincidental. There is likely other factors involved. But something that I've often heard people suggest is that often autism and bad parenting are related. And this is where we really have to understand the nuances of this. You cannot cause a person to be autistic by parenting them badly. As far as we know, you're either born autistic or you're not born autistic. What we can say, though, is that often what happens is a parent of an autistic child will be stressed more than a parent of a child who is neurotypical, because they have to adapt to parenting a child with special needs. Sometimes it brings out the negativity in people. Sometimes parents can display as rather stressful and their children can detect it. And something that's really important, which I've constantly emphasized, is that children know more than they can produce, which means that even if a child can't describe something, they'll be able to understand a lot. And even if a child is autistic and non-verbal, they can still absorb what's happening in their world. If you are overly stressed as a parent, it's not that parenting that has caused a person to be autistic, it's the stress of having to parent a child who has special needs, which is bringing out those unhelpful parenting characteristics.
And I definitely feel like it comes a lot back to genetics and genes too. Um, that's a really big one. And I feel like, for instance, for me, I was diagnosed when I was 11 years old, but I do feel like there are bits and pieces. Ever since I was born, I've had autism, but like it wasn't commonly recognized as common as it is today. But I did start walking late. I did reach milestones later. So it was evident that I had autism, but it just wasn't really seen as something that I went through until I was 11 years old because it was misdiagnosed so many times.
Absolutely, misdiagnosis and inappropriate labeling is certainly a problem. But that's one of the reasons why classification serves such an important purpose, that if you classify something correctly, then you can correctly identify what sort of help might be useful. But if you incorrectly classify, then it's possible to do the exact opposite and actually hurt people. An extension of this is that people assume that autism always constitutes a mental illness or a disability. This is something that I'll discuss more in the future, but in reality, there are plenty of people who are autistic who are also completely self-sufficient. They know how to, they can take care of themselves and they can run businesses and work just like any other person could. So, Lindsay, you have a business. I'm a counselor and I run my own practice and work with a range of different contexts. I work with people who are neurotypical, neurodivergent. I work with relationships as well, which another myth. People think that autistic folks can't understand relationships, which is not inherently the case. We're both fully functioning human beings. So not being able to function fully is the case for some autistic folk, but not all of us.
And also for me, I'm really big on like, I know it's a disability, but I don't like to think of it as a disability. I honestly like to look at it as a different ability because I feel like we all have different abilities that we go through on the autism spectrum because it's a wide range spectrum. And I know that that's probably just my personal take on it, that I don't like to call it a disability even if it is one. I just like to like change my mindset over the years because over the years I've worked really hard on changing my mindset from poor me to, you know what, how can I be an inspiration for others? How can I help others navigating life on the autism spectrum? Which is why I started talking about inspirational thoughts and stuff in my mindset on my inspirational page on Instagram. But for me, I never really wanted to talk about my autism in the beginning. It wasn't something I wanted to talk about because I didn't want to be looked at as different. Not like I'm different, but I'm not less, and I shouldn't be. We shouldn't be looked at as less. And so that's a really big thing because when I was diagnosed with autism, even when people talked about it, I would get quite cranky and upset because I was like, this is my story to share, not yours. And I don't want people to label me as different just because I may have a different ability or see the world from a different point of view or a different way, because we're all special in our own unique ways. And even if we do have autism, we still have amazing things to bring to the table. We just may think and see and do differently.
Well said, Lindsay. And a major problem with autism diagnosis is that all too often it's easy to become fixated for medical professionals on categorization, but sometimes categorization can be more problematic than it actually is helpful, because there are some presentations of autism, such as in your own case, where the differences that we have from what we consider to be a normal person, normal in inverted commas because it's something of a problematic term, The differences are not so great that we have to be labelled and treated as though there's something wrong. There are plenty of people in the world who, for example, just blatantly do not have a sense of humour. Does that alone make them autistic? No. You don't have to have a sense of humour to be a good person. I mean, there might be something hurting within you that I would, as a therapist, suggest you probably look at, but it doesn't make you a bad person, and it doesn't mean that there's inherently something wrong with you. Same with understanding subtleties. Like, a lot of us don't necessarily pick up subtleties, and I've known people who are possibly not autistic who don't pick up subtleties, but we don't necessarily label that person as having something wrong with them. Maybe not having the relational skills that we wish they did. People can have problems in their relational skills and not have autism. And the problem is that when we put the label autistic on someone, it can sometimes attune our attention to treating them as though there's something wrong with them, rather than looking at them as an individual and saying, yes, you may have different needs and different abilities, but I'll treat you as an individual based on your needs and abilities, not based on what the label thinks you are. And I actually would argue that this is a mindset that can be spread towards more people than just inside the autistic community, and that we can become more accepting and should become more accepting of people's differences and people's needs across the spectrum of society, and not just look at this group as having special needs, but everyone else having to make do with being assumed that they're normal. Labeling somebody as autistic when it could actually be more pathologizing to them and actually lead the people in their lives and the people helping them to assume that they have more intensive needs when they actually don't, can actually potentially be harmful.
And autism or not, honestly, I feel like everyone should be treated as special in their own unique ways, and everyone should be treated the same. Like, respectfully, you give what you get and you take what you get, but also I feel like people should be treated the way that everyone should be treated the way we want to be treated. And another thing is, I have my full driver's license, my class 5 driver's license, and I passed all my driving exams on the first try. And yes, I may have autism, but people without autism sometimes don't pass on the first try. So, autism or not, we all have something to bring to the table. I just think it's a really important thing to look at.
Kindness and consideration for people is nowhere near as difficult as what people think it is. And if you adopt a certain mindset, it just becomes a part of nature. And this is often something that I experience when I'm counselling people, for example, who are neurodivergent or who are gay or bisexual or transgender, or people who come from different cultures. Even a lot of the academic literature basically makes us believe that when someone walks in, you have to see that they're different and you have to treat them differently. But I'd say that the correct approach is, when they come in, assume that there's something about them you don't know and be willing to ask them questions and understand themselves as an individual. Because regardless of what group they belong to, they may have experiences and perspectives that are completely incongruent with what people normally expect of that group. They may not fit into boxes. And if we take that approach and the assumption we make is this person has their own unique qualities and their own set of values and their own set of experiences, you'll largely avoid stigmatizing people and misjudging people, because your mind will always be attuned to understanding them as an individual.
And we should always treat others the way we want to be treated. I think that's a really big golden rule. And personally, for me, I had a lot of things happen to me, but I try not to think of it as a bad thing, but like, everyone should be treated equally the way that they give. And I feel like that's really important. But when I was diagnosed with autism, a lot of people, I feel like, looked at me differently because of my autism, but I wish that they wouldn't look at me differently. I wish I would be looked at as the same as everyone else, because I am the same like everyone else. It's just I have a different ability, and I do see the world from a different point of view.
Absolutely. Empathy and thinking about how we would feel if we were in the other person's position is of utmost importance. Something else that people often assume is that autism is based on one quality. So to give an example, if somebody has an incredibly large breadth of knowledge of a particular subject, or they have an incredible memory, people might look at that and they might use labels informally like autistic or savant or similar, but that completely misses the purpose of autism as a classification. Autism is not just one characteristic. Just because you have one characteristic, it doesn't mean that that makes you autistic. And it can be rather patronizing for people to, in much the same way that they make assumptions about you if you are autistic, it can be rather patronizing for people to use those labels without actually knowing the significance of what they mean. For someone to be autistic, there must be a number of different qualities, because if all those qualities exist, then we can be certain, or at least more reassured, that the autism is, number one, a valid diagnosis, and number two, it gives us a more solid reassurance that certain types of intervention, like neuroaffirming therapy, for example, are going to be the most appropriate and the most safe forms of helping for them. Treating someone as autistic just because they have one quality that happens to be considered autistic could well lead us to, again, misjudge that person, and ultimately it can be rather patronizing.
And another thing that I just came to mind to think of is I feel like with my autism, and everyone has autism, I feel like this could be different or not, but for me, everyone has a superpower when it comes to autism, and especially for me, my superpower is attention to detail. I pay quite close attention to detail, like my photography, for instance. I could take a picture and people don't always catch like what I take a picture and they're like, wow, there was an insect on that flower, and I'm like, yeah, or a butterfly like right in the right spot, and I just see these attention, like I just pay such close attention to detail. Another thing is lining things up. I used to work in a daycare, and if there were buckets or something of toys, I would just like organize everything by color, shape, size. And it's something I enjoy doing, but I don't know, maybe that's a trait of autism, but I really love lining things up, organizing, paying attention to detail, and just focusing on the little things.
As a counsellor, I receive referrals from others, and I also like to help my audience become aware of resources and other providers which may be beneficial, as well as help other individuals and organisations gain exposure. That's why I host the Your Listener Partner Network, and I'd like to thank my partners for their support. I'd like to introduce Ali's Place Counselling. On the scenic Mornington Peninsula, Ali's Place provides individual, couple and family counselling with specialisation in relationship therapy. Their devoted team provides a warm, welcoming and safe environment and treats each client as an individual to help them to tell their unique stories, untangle their situations, build healthy relations with themselves and others, and ultimately find a route to where they would like to be. They work with a range of different concerns and teach crucial communication, conflict management and problem-solving skills. They are also home to the Ali's Place Academy, developing the skills of both newer and more experienced therapists. Find them at www.alisplace.com.au. Attention to detail and devotion to it is a really healthy trait, because I talk about this often actually. I talk about the importance of self-discipline and having high standards and setting standards for ourselves. Not only does it result in us doing better for ourselves and for society, but it also facilitates self-confidence, and it allows us to be the best that we can be. And having that attention to detail is really healthy. There are plenty of roles that, in general, I think people need more attention to detail. And working in social services myself, I find that there is a startling lack of attention to detail that we could really benefit from, and our clients could really benefit from. Something that I find rather humorously gives me the same sense of satisfaction is when I finish typing a document and I'm ready to finalise it, and I select all the text and I justify it so everything lines up with the left and the right margins perfectly. That to me is an incredibly cathartic experience. Everything feels just right when I do that.
I do find though that when I get overwhelmed or overstimulated, like I live in a basement suite, and everything for me, it could either be going really well or really not so well, because sometimes I have a really good time keeping up with all the cleaning, everything's done, but then something catches me off guard, or I feel disappointed or something happens and I have to start from square one again, and I feel like I take 10 steps forward and 2 steps back, and it's just like I feel like I have so much done, and then that one little thing catches me off guard and I have to start from square one and clean up all over again. And it's just like sometimes it's hard to keep everything balanced. And another thing, I agree with you. I'm quite the same when I line everything up during the page column. So I definitely agree with that.
Indeed, and it can be a lot, it can be a major stressor when something does catch you off guard and you feel an urge and a need to then start from the beginning, even if you were doing well thus far. It can feel hard to orient yourself towards the task if you don't have everything in order from the start. So we have to remember that that can be quite a challenging experience. Something that I find people assume, I think people assume this is that autistic people can't relate to a neurotypical person. And this is completely false. Yes, we may have trouble relating sometimes, but I think quite often that what actually happens is we can relate in the sense that we can understand why people might live a certain way. It's just that we don't agree with it. And there's a difference between not being able to relate to something and not agreeing with something. I can understand, for example, why people might use drugs or alcohol. I don't believe in it myself. I've never done it myself. I can understand the reason why cognitively. I can understand the rationale. It's because people feel such stress that they don't feel a way out of it. But I don't agree with it. And I know that there are better ways to handle stress. So I think that people assume that not being able to relate in the sense of not wanting to do something yourself or agreeing with something constitutes being oblivious to somebody else's motives. And I think that's something that we need to debunk, because you can cognitively understand something without agreeing with it.
And I agree. And I've also heard that talked about too is like people with autism. I've heard that sometimes they don't know how to be friends with people that aren't neurotypical and don't have autism. But for me, I have friends with both autism and not autism, with and without. And I noticed that sometimes it's kind of finding the middle ground, because sometimes people could take advantage or like not use people with autism because we're so kind and we're such wonderful individuals that people kind of take advantage of our kindness, and they kind of can change our brains a little bit into thinking that we're not as smart as we think we are, and then they take advantage or just use us.
Absolutely. And I've seen that happen. I've seen people with autism be exploited. I've seen it happen in therapy before as well, which was a horrifying story that I was became aware of. A corollary of what we're discussing here is also the assumption that autistic folks don't want relations with others, or they lack empathy. And again, an incorrect conceptualization. Empathy is the ability to understand how somebody else is feeling and then to convey it. Yes, an autistic person may have trouble understanding how somebody else is feeling. It's not deliberate, but often what happens is autistic folks do understand how somebody else is feeling. They just may have trouble knowing what the socially appropriate way is to express it, but they certainly have a way to express it. It's just that other people may not recognize that that's how they express empathy. And at the same time, I think more often than not, definitely more often than not, an autistic person wants what most people want: relations with others, good friends, relations with their family, a partner perhaps. We may have trouble forming those connections at times because our needs in a relationship might be different to other people's needs. Perhaps it might be difficult for other people to understand us and relate to us. It doesn't change the fact that we do understand the world, we can feel emotions. To a large extent, we can understand them, and we want to be with people. It's not antisocial. We're not antisocial. We just see the world differently and express things differently. And it's incredibly short-sighted to think of that as antisocial, because if we think of that as antisocial, then basically any person who doesn't conform to a strict set of norms could be antisocial by that standard, and that's highly stigmatizing.
And I definitely feel like we definitely want what others want. Like even without autism, like I would love to have kids one day, get married, own a house. Like there's so many things I want. We want the same as like even if we don't have autism, we want the same. But sometimes it can be overlooked, or we can kind of be like, oh, they have autism, so they don't want what we want, but we do want what others want. It's just hard to understand sometimes because I feel like it doesn't always happen the way we want. And a lot of things for me is I've had to pivot the way I see the world because I've seen the world and I want so many great things in my life, and I have had great things in my life, but things haven't always went on a straight path to the way I wanted them to happen. And so, for instance, I wanted all these things by a certain age, and I'm 27 in June, and a lot of the things I wanted by now, I haven't I haven't reached that goal. And it's not to say that I won't reach that goal. It's just, I've had to pivot and look at the world in a different view. And maybe I will have kids one day. Maybe I will find a life partner. Maybe I will buy a house one day. But just because it didn't happen on my timeline doesn't mean that it won't happen at all.
Absolutely, and good on you for keeping the motivation and to keep persisting with your goals. It's absolutely important for any person. Persistence is the most important factor here. Something else I'd like to bring to attention is, especially when working with children, autistic children, people assume that autistic folks are apathetic. And again, this is a myth because we don't understand the difference between apathy and how we present emotion. So in society, most people demonstrate interest with a particular subject using emotional cues. For example, they use facial expressions to demonstrate different feelings or different thoughts about a subject. They might use body language. They might use differences in their tone of voice. By understanding implicitly that those cues mean certain things, it helps people to understand how each other are feeling. It's a form of communication. An autistic person may use more verbal expression and less non-verbal expression. Non-verbal expression may be something that's lacking in an autistic presentation, which is not inherently bad, but especially when we see it in children, it's easy to assume that the flat facial expression and the flat tone of voice indicate that the child doesn't care about what they're doing or doesn't care about you. And that is a complete myth. An autistic person may not express emotion in the same way that we expect. It doesn't mean that they're not having the same thoughts or the same engagement. It's completely different. It's actually a good example of this. I find this rather humorous, actually, is that when I was in university, my lecturers would watch recordings of me counselling my colleagues in role plays, and they would say sometimes, your facial expression doesn't change much, which suggests that you're not really listening or you're not really understanding what the other person's saying. Well, in the years that I've been a counsellor, a client has never told me, hey, John, I hate your flat face. You never understand what I'm thinking, or you're not listening to me. A client has never said that to me. So even in academia, it's an assumption that holds, and we need to change this because not everyone expresses engagement the same way, and that's just a fact of life.
And another thing that came to mind is I'm quite emotional. People with autism, sometimes we can think that we're not emotional, but sometimes my emotions, I can be overly emotional. Like, for instance, nostalgia, like looking at how far I've come or seeing things from the past can make me emotional, especially goodbyes. Like, if I have to say goodbye to someone and I don't know when I'll see them again, that's another thing that will make me emotional. And sometimes people think that people with autism aren't emotional, but for me, I quite am. Like, I have quite high emotions.
And emotions can be difficult to cope with at times, but at the same time, emotions are a way of communicating with ourselves and with other people, and emotional experiences can be quite transformative as well. So it's important that people see both not just the challenges with those experiences, but also the ways that they benefit us as well, and the potential sources of enjoyment from them.
With autism, people don't understand what we're saying. For instance, we can mix up our words, or for instance, I'll be talking about something, and if I get nervous, I trip over my words, and people don't always understand. Like, for instance, I'll be making a phone call, and sometimes I talk so fast and I'm nervous, people ask me to slow down. But I think that's a really big thing with the miscommunication. People don't always take the time to listen and learn. And I think if we do talk too fast or have anxiety and trip over our words, it's a good idea to ask us to repeat it again, because I do have anxiety, and that's another thing. With autism, sometimes it falls on other things too. Like we could have ADHD, autism, anxiety, depression. Even though we have autism, sometimes it can fall into another thing too.
I'd like to share some light-hearted perspectives as well. And by light-hearted, I don't mean that we're making light of the situation or denying the importance of the subject, but more seeing some humor in some of the ironies of how people will inherently treat autistic folks as having specific qualities when without seeing that those qualities exist elsewhere in the world, and really treating autistic folks as if they're different and as if there's something wrong with them when they may do when the person doing the judging may do the exact same thing at times. So the first one that I have is when people tell you to do something a certain way and not the way that you would normally do it. And this can be in the workplace, in school, in a variety of different ways. It's not to say that we shouldn't be open to improvement. We can all make mistakes, or we can all have room for improvement. It's part of being human. But when people tell you to do something a specific way and you think to yourself, I think my way was more effective, but I'll do it your way just to satisfy you. Then you do it, it doesn't work, and the person blames you for not doing it correctly when you did it exactly as they told you to. It's relevant in the discussion of autism because everybody is always quick to judge things they don't understand and always quick to say, you know what, my way's the correct way, therefore if you don't do it my way, you're the problem. But then the person doing the judging is the one who actually has it wrong, and it's the other person who actually had a point, and they're always quick to blame other people instead of acknowledging, hey, maybe this other person actually did have a point and they actually were doing something differently for the right reasons.
One thing for me probably is just understanding, like, when people think one way and we think another way, and they judge us because we think one way. Um, for instance, people could say, like, for instance, this is the way we think, but because you have autism, you think this way. And a lot of times on the autism spectrum, for instance, I take medications, but some people on the autism spectrum don't take medications. A lot of times people ask me, oh, what are your meds for instance? It's not because I don't want to take medications, but being asked that all the time, and especially when people say they, because everyone sometimes does and sometimes doesn't, so I just trying to over explain or explain things all the time can irk me.
Something that I find is particularly stigmatizing is when people are quick to judge autistic folks for doing something that they themselves did not realize was socially unacceptable. Something that is quite common, more common than people want to acknowledge, is that autistic folks want to understand the world and want to integrate. And honestly, it's heartbreaking considering that often a lot of neurotypical folks don't care about integration and don't care about working in harmony with other people. So it's not right to judge autistic folks for being different when they're trying to integrate. But all too often, because of the stigma and the pressure that is put on the autistic community to constantly be normal like other people, what that leads a lot of autistic folks to do is then try to predict what is going to be acceptable in this situation, or what is this person trying to tell me, or what is the accepted norm in this situation that I'm expected to understand. They try their best to make an interpretation of it, they enact it, and then someone else judges them for making a mistake of it or not doing it the way that they should have, so to speak, done it. Now, this is a complete fallacy because society is so ignorant that it thinks, oh, you should know how to do everything, and if you don't, that's not my fault, figure it out yourself. And so people might say, okay, well, I'll try to figure it out myself. And then when they make a mistake, oh, you should have known better. Okay, well, where was I supposed to learn it? It's so ridiculous to think of someone as wanting to be rude when in reality they were just trying their best to make an interpretation of and apply it to the situation. And I've seen this happen by people who do exactly the same thing. It's often the people who make those judgments I'm willing to predict are people who genuinely just don't care about other people's feelings. They don't care about other people's reality. They don't care about the fact that we're all different. they'll just blatantly speak their mind, no matter whether it offends anyone or anyone else. And that could be incredibly rude in some situations. But the minute that they meet someone that's different, they're always willing to place judgment on them and not look at themselves and say, hey, maybe I need to be more considerate of other people.
And another one for me that really bugs me is when people judge us for being slower than others without autism. Because yes, we may be slower, but we shouldn't be judged because of it. Like, for instance, I work so hard, and I notice I'm slower than someone that maybe learns the job at the same time. But when people um, judge me or say, "Oh, you're slow," it's like, yeah, I know I'm slow, but please don't judge me because I'm trying the best that I can with the resources that I have. And just because I have autism doesn't mean you should nitpick or tell me that I'm slow because I'm trying with everything that I have, with everything that I can do. But sometimes it's hard when people think that we're not as good as someone without autism, because my autism makes me who I am, but it's hard for me to understand it sometimes.
Something that I find rather comical is when people judge autistic folk for not having an understanding of social norms and an understanding of when to be diplomatic. I tell you, I don't know I obviously don't know every time I meet an autistic person. Sometimes I can identify when someone else is autistic. Other times it might be more subtle and I just don't think of it. I can't see it overtly. But I've had plenty of conversations and been privy to conversations involving neurotypical folk where they do things that are completely socially unacceptable. And I'm looking at this situation and going, well, my autistic self would have known a mile away that that was unacceptable and wouldn't have done it. And I know plenty of autistic folks who would have done the same. Now, I love my family. I absolutely adore my relationships with my family and really love them. But it's rather comical sometimes when I'm sitting down at a family gathering and somebody starts talking about trying to matchmake for me. There's a particular member of my family who likes doing this. And I'm standing here going, I'm the autistic one, but I'm the only one in this interaction that apparently sees that you shouldn't pry yourself into people's sex lives. Like, can you see how that could make me uncomfortable? Or sometimes people are very blunt in the way they present for no apparent reason. Like, for example, they might sound grumpy all the time, or they might sound annoyed at you when they're really not. And again, I understand people have backstories, and I understand that, but there are plenty of autistic folks who identify in advance that they don't want to be blunt or that they don't want to be rude to people. So again, I'm just trying to show here that it's illogical to say it's always autistic folks that don't understand these norms, when in reality there are plenty of neurotypical folks who don't understand the norms, may not pick up the subtleties, and sometimes they don't even care.
And another thing that came to mind is sometimes people with autism, I know I don't struggle with this, but sometimes people with autism can struggle with hands-on, like tickling or just not knowing social cues. That's one thing people think that because I don't like to be touched or want a hug without asking, sometimes people do, people with autism don't always understand like when it needs to happen. So for me, I don't like tickling. I don't like that. So people just don't understand. But I know they're trying to be kind about it, but sometimes they don't understand.
As a case in point, actually, I'm very aware of other people's boundaries that way. So like when I meet someone for the first time, it's a simple case of I shake hands with them at the very most, but I'm also make sure that I don't touch people unless they themselves are either close enough to me, so they're a friend, like someone who knows me really well, or they're a member of my family, or they're my partner. I'm not presumptive with touch, and I find a lot of neurotypical people are quite presumptive with how they touch other people, which to me is again an irony because people are constantly saying, hey, autistic folks don't understand social norms, and yet we're often the ones who are thinking ahead about what might make somebody else uncomfortable and are thinking about and are making sure that we don't do things that make other people uncomfortable. Some people say we worry too much. They say, autistic folk, they're highly stressed, they worry about everything. I've actually seen, to be honest with you, out of the people that I've known, the people that tend to worry about insignificant details more have been neurotypicals. I'm not sure if that's a generalization. I'm not sure if that's a truism, but all too often, when a difficulty arises, my thoughts are, okay, this is difficult. Let's deal with it. I know it's not the same for every autistic person, but then I see a lot of neurotypical folks absolutely fretting about every minute detail, and I think, gee, and they judge us for being too stressed. I mean, I'm sorry other people are stressed, but a bit of a double standard.
And I think another thing is people sometimes think we overthink too much and they don't always try and put themselves in our shoes. And I think that's a really big one. Like we can think a lot and we can overthink every single detail, everything that could go wrong. But instead of thinking everything that could go wrong, we have to try and think about everything that could go right. That's another reason why I've worked so hard on my mindset and changing my mindset over the years because I used to be quite negative, and so when you change your negative thoughts to positive thoughts, it actually makes a positive impact.
A final point that I'm thinking of is a characteristic of autism can be a lack of geospatial awareness, and that is a reality for some autistic folks. But I walk into a shopping center and I see people on their phones walking in a zigzag and completely unaware of the fact that they're about to bump into someone else or something else. And so whenever I walk somewhere, I actually walk as if I'm driving. I stick to the left side of a walkway. I try to look ahead and predict what other people are going to do so as to avoid any collisions and to not be in anybody's way. I try to take the path of least resistance so that I'm least likely to have a conflict with somebody else or to hit someone or get in somebody's way. I'm constantly thinking ahead about those things. Most people are neurotypical, hence the term typical. And yet I see this in any public space, people completely lacking in geospatial awareness. So this myth completely has to be debunked. It's not just autistic folks that lack geospatial awareness. Yes, in some areas they may, but I think we have to de-emphasize it unless it is really a neurodevelopmental problem for them. And honestly, push learning about geospatial awareness in the general population far more often than we do.
And another thing that came to mind is sensory overload. So I love listening to music a lot. I really love music because it helps me when I'm overstimulated or overwhelmed. And also another thing is when people bump into me, it really bugs me. I know people don't mean to, but sometimes I can really overreact sometimes if someone bumps into me and they don't apologize or say sorry. And I know it happens when places are busy, but that's another reason why I love wearing headphones because it really helps with my overstimulation.
Well, Lindsay, this has been an engaging discussion, so thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be on your podcast today.
It's my pleasure. Now, if my audience wants to find you, where can they find you?
Well, I love sharing on Instagram through Inspiring Essentials. Another place I love to share is on Facebook in my Positivity Around Life on the Autism Spectrum page.
Excellent. There will be links to your work in the description of this episode. And to our audience, thank you everyone for joining us. As per usual, if you have concerns about yourself or somebody else, please never take what you find in the media or on the internet as advice. Seek advice from a professional or someone else you trust. If you're seeking counselling from me in Australia, you can find my details in the description of this episode. And if you have feedback on the program, whether it be to be a guest or to give your thoughts or to suggest a topic of discussion, please feel free to contact me. I love to hear from my audience. And until next time, take care.
Thank you. Take care.